Welcome back to the Virtual Classroom AP Euro Edition for part 2 of our lecture on totalitarianism. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Now let's pick up where we left off last time, which of course was with discussing the rise of totalitarianism in the 20th century in Europe. Now last time we discussed the comparisons between absolutism and the 20th century totalitarian regimes. And then we went in to discuss how communism developed during the post-Russian Civil War during the 1920s and 1930s in the Soviet Union. Now let's turn our attention now and make a little comparison case about how totalitarian fascism will arise in both Italy and Germany. So in Italy, it was a fairly common case of what was going on in that post-World War I period. But in Italy, liberalism had been making progress during the late 19th century, early 20th century. Italy had established itself as a unified nation. They were a fairly liberal state with civil rights and a constitutional monarchy under Victor Emmanuel. However, everything changes in 1919. Now, if you recall correctly, during World War I, during the first year of the war, Italy had sided with Germany on the Central Powers. However, after a year, they switched sides and joined the Allied powers. So at the Versailles Treaty in 1919, Italy was expecting some big things. In fact, they were expecting that they were going to receive either or both Austrian and or Ottoman territory to, again, expand their empire. Number one, so the first thing they expected to get was this either Austrian or Ottoman territories. Second thing they expected, at the very least, they had been promised, was to receive some of Germany's African colonies after World War I, and Italian nationalists were outraged, irate, and just plain out pissed off. Because at the Versailles Treaty, they got basically nothing. In fact, the Prime Minister, Vittorio Orlando, he left the Paris Peace Treaty delegation even before it was completed, realizing that Italy was getting the shaft. They were going to get screwed by the Versailles Treaty in their minds. Well then, to make matters worse in 1919, so think about this for a minute. They fought on the side of the Allies. The war ends, peace breaks out, then the peace treaty comes in 1919, and they get bunkus. Well, also in 1919 was a recession, depression in Italy that spread through a lot of Europe, and it caused nationwide strikes and class tension in Italy. And by this point, you think about it, by 1919, what's going on in Russia? Communism is building. And the wealthy classes of Italy began to fear that if something was not done to quell the strikes, quell the violence, quell all these problems, that, yeah, communism could very well sweep over Italy. And so they were looking for a strong anti-communist leader. And who should arise? But of course, Benito Mussolini. Now, by 1921, these revolutionary socialists, these conservatives, and these property owners all came into agreement. So three groups make up what we would call fascist Italy. Number one, these revolutionary socialists. These believe the ideas of Marxism, that we need to create a socialist state. Number two group were the conservatives. Those, again, who had been opposed to all the liberal movements of the current government in Italy under the King Emmanuel. And then number three, property owners, because they fear that if they don't do something quickly, these wealthy property owners, they're going to lose their property because of communism taking over. And so these three groups coalesce and come together. And as a result, fascism in Italy eventually becomes this combination of conservative authoritarianism that arose in Europe after Napoleon, and modern totalitarianism. Though, I do want to qualify, totalitarianism in Italy never reached the heights of either Russia or Germany. Now, Il Duce, Benito Mussolini, he's going to rise to power. There's a little background on him. He was the editor of a socialist newspaper. He, as a socialist, originally disavowed war. He was largely a pacifist. However, at heart, he was also a nationalist, and he began to believe the only way to have, well, a socialist takeover was to, well, resort to violence. And so he begins to ditch some of those socialist leanings, specifically the one about violence, and instead embrace a much more nationalist agenda. And he begins to organize what we call the fascist party, in this case in Italy. The fascist party, fascism, combines socialism and nationalism, which at their top, at their root, seems very, well, oxymoronic, because nationalism requires territorial expansion to enlarge and make your nation great. Socialism, theoretically, is opposed to war. So fascism combines elements from each one. So, for instance, they do want territorial expansion, as we'll see with Hitler and Mussolini. It combines the idea of the benefit for workers and, of course, land reform for peasants, unlike you'll see in communism. And don't forget, fascism is a very anti-communist regime. And so, by the way, fun little side fact here, the party, the fascist idea, the name fascism or fascist, comes after the name fasces, which are the rods carried by the imperial Roman officials that they use as symbols of power. That's where the actual name comes from. But 1920, Mussolini begins to gain support of the conservative classes and the frightened middle classes who were afraid of communist takeover. In large part, remember, under socialism, they would also fear, but because he had abandoned a large part of socialism, they began to embrace his anti-socialist, anti-communist rhetoric. And by this point, he abandons those socialist program ideals. Instead, he organized what's called the black shirts that you see pictured on the right. These black shirts, the squadristi, these were paramilitary forces that began to use violence throughout Italy. And they began to attack communists and socialists and any other member of the fascist program, enemy of the fascist program. And again, we'll talk about the brown shirts later of Adolf Hitler. But these black shirts, their job was to essentially punish through violence, to deter anyone who was, well, anti-fascist. And what it did, though, was undermine the stability of the Victor Emmanuel's government. And in October 1922, they began to march on Rome. The black shirts, alongside this group of fascists who just began to march on the capital in Rome, and they began to demand the resignation of the king and the appointment of one Benito Mussolini to become the new government leader, to form a new government and be its leader. And this large group of fascists, along with these black shirts, and they're armed, they appear before Victor Emmanuel and basically force him to appoint Mussolini. And in this wake of this march on Rome in October 1922, the Victor Emmanuel constitutional monarchy government collapses, which virtually allows Mussolini to be able to form his new government however he wants. And sure enough, King Victor Emmanuel III will give him, theoretically temporary, but gave him dictator powers for a period of 1 year. Again, temporary. Note the trend here. So it gives him dictator powers for 1 year. And the goal of this temporary dictatorship was to quell the nation's social unrest. In other words, quell the violence. Because, giving a person with a God complex temporary dictator powers always works, nothing ever goes wrong. And so what he does, he begins to reorganize the government, create a government in his own image that he wants. In fact, you can see his quote. He created what was called the corporate state, also known as the syndicalist corporate system. This became the economic basis for Italian fascism. I'll repeat that, the corporate state, also known as the syndicalist corporate system. And this becomes the economic basis. As Mussolini says, quote, everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. By 1928, all labor unions in Italy were organized into government-controlled syndicates. Again, syndicalist corporate system. So this is not exactly the idea of the socialist idea here, where the workers began to take control of the production. No, these unions are now arms of the government. And in its wake, he creates his dictatorship. Notice this was 1928. He took power in 1922. Big surprise, he never gave up his dictatorship. And so by 1928, he is now full dictator. He's in full control. And the right to vote is severely limited. So he cuts off voting rights. All candidates for the Italian parliament were first selected by the Fascist Party. So good luck getting any liberals or any other communists involved. And these only dedicated, true Kool-Aid drinkers of fascism would be put in control of public schools. And the government did seek to try to control leisure time. There would be a fascist youth movement to try and indoctrinate young people. And there would be some sponsored after-work approved activities for adults, for the working class, but Mussolini never actually became all-powerful. He was never able to truly become a full totalitarian regime, in large part because he was never able to fascistize, fully control, the Italian society by controlling their leisure time. This is in contrast to places like Russia, which largely did. This is in contrast to, we'll talk about later, with Hitler, who largely does. So a few failings as far as becoming a full dictator for Mussolini was, one, he does not fully control leisure time. Number two, the old power structure of conservatives still remains. There are a number of conservatives still in power. It's not a full changeover, unlike the purge that took place in Russia. He also doesn't get rid of the military. He keeps them largely intact, which we'll see. Obviously, in Russia, they killed 40,000. We'll see it again in Germany, where Hitler has to deal with them. And the church remains largely intact. It's difficult to mess with the Roman Catholic Church. Now, he did propagandize himself as, controlling everything, business, labor, everything. But again, he doesn't fully establish that ruthless police state. Now, this is kind of a weird but fun stat. Between 1926 and 1944, when he's killed, only 23 political prisoners were actually killed by Mussolini. Now, I'm sorry for those 23 families, those 23 people who died, but compare that to anywhere else under, absolutism. I'm pretty sure, King Henry killed more wives than just that. Not really. But whereas when it came to the gender issue, again, he was much more restrictive than under communists in the Soviet Union. Now, again, while women didn't achieve full rights, even though it was purported to do so under both Lenin and Stalin, women were allowed to work outside the home. In fascist Italy under Mussolini, this was not the case. In fact, women were reduced to the quote-unquote traditional role of women that emphasized this old social structure, this old patriarchy. This also became the case, by the way, for Nazi Germany. And this was, divorce was abolished. women were told to stay home and procreate. In other words, women get in the kitchen, cook the food, clean the house, and make babies. So what has really changed in European history from 1450 to, well, 1930s Italy? Now, again, like I said, no one is pure evil. And there were a number of accomplishments under Mussolini. First of all, public works projects. Anyone who's ever been to Rome, you can see the buildings that were built. They are gorgeous. So public work projects that do put people to work, which of course will help keep them out of the depression. While the rest of Europe is going through a depression, Italy will largely be able to get through it because he is remilitarizing and through large public works projects. Other public works projects besides the buildings and the beautiful buildings that he's created were other internal improvements such as electrification of the country, road projects to connect. It's a very long country, a long nation, and have roads connect the nation together in a better way was very important to maintaining his control as a totalitarian leader. He suppressed the mafia. So he helped eliminate the black market. Now, it's still totalitarian control, but it is some improvement. And despite being a fascist dictator of totalitarianism, he does actually make a more efficient government at the local level. Now, we can criticize his upper level, national government all we want, but at the local level, he actually improved efficiency by reducing the bureaucracy. And he actually did improve the justice system. Remember, he only killed 23 people as far as enemies of the state. And so largely, he actually improved the justice system in Italy. And in 1929, he will issue the Lateran Pact, which resulted in the reconciliation of the papacy. In fact, the Vatican was recognized as a tiny independent state. Yes, this dictator, this totalitarian dictator, gave up control of the Vatican area as pacification and even paid them $92 million to cover for the seized church lands around Italy. And again, recognizing the Vatican as its own tiny independent state within a totalitarian government is quite monumental. And of course, in return, Pope Pius XII will recognize legitimacy of the Italian state. So again, win-win for both sides. So for his part, Italy made some improvements despite all of its obvious failures and detriments. Now, let's move on to everyone's favorite topic of the 1930s when it comes to Europe, and that, of course, is Nazi Germany. Now, Nazi Germany. We need to go back and understand what's happening at the end of World War I. Remember, for the average German, the Treaty of Versailles was horrific. Remember, they were forced to pay reparations. They were forced to accept, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. And they are assigned sole, full blame of the war. This cripples this new government. And of course, if you recall my last talk with you guys, remember, this was horrible for this new government. Remember, this brand new government, democratic government, one of their first tasks to do is to, retreat, surrender, give in, despite the fact there were no Allied troops in Germany proper at the end of World War I on November 11, 1918. And so many people believed that this surrender was illegitimate. And of course, then the next big action this new government had to do, the Weimar Republic, was to sign this Treaty of Versailles, assigning all guilt on Germany. So in the face of this, we see the rise of Nazism. Now, what is Nazism? Well, it's extreme nationalism plus racism. So we're going to combine this extreme nationalism that we saw with Il Duce in Italy and combine it with extreme racism, and we get what's called Nazism. This hyper-nationalism, again, they want to expand. You see the term on the bottom of the screen right now, leaving some living space. But this hyper-nationalism that goes along with it, this idea that this what was called the stab in the back myth, that the Weimar Republic, the current government in the 1920s in Germany, had stabbed German citizens in the back because they take power, they surrender, and then they are forced to, accept all guilt and these war reparations. And so this adds to the nation's frustrations of this new government is not really that great. Well, then you combine that with racism, the racial superiority of the Aryan race, the Germanic peoples, and of course, on the opposite side, the inferiority of Slavic peoples, and of course, Jews. Now, the man pictured on the right, you all know him, Adolf Hitler. He, of course, after the war, was kind of lost. And he was assigned a small spy mission to spy out supposed enemy political parties that might cause trouble for the Weimar Republic. And of course, one of them he went to was a very small group that actually only had about 7 members when he first went there. And it was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, i.e., Nazi Party. And this tiny group, 7 people, he went to the beer hall, he sat down, he listened to them to become a spy, see if they really were a danger. And he became enamored with this idea of this hyper-nationalism along with racism. And of course, he very quickly became a leader in the Nazi Party. Next thing he did, he organized what's called the Brown Shirts, the SA. And this was a Nazi paramilitary group that terrorized political opponents in the streets. Again, notice the similarity to the black shirts of Mussolini. Hitler was a big fan of Mussolini. In effect, this private army of the Nazis, who were basically owed their loyalty, their allegiance to Adolf Hitler himself. They became Hitler's hit squad, basically, during the 1920s. Well, in 1923, Hitler overreached. 1923, he has a failed attempt, known as the Beer Hall Putsch, to overthrow the state of Bavaria. Then, of course, start with Bavaria, then go to Greater Germany. And, of course, he was sentenced to 1 year in jail. But while it was a tremendous failure, Hitler was never one to take failure as a negative thing. Instead, he saw this as a positive thing. And he used his time in the trial to spout his ideas. He actually defended himself. He was given a very lenient 1 year sentence for trying to overthrow the government. And during this 1 year stay, he really only had people come and go as they pleased. He ended up writing his best-selling book, Mein Kampf, picture on the right, in which case he begins to outline how Nazi ideology and what his belief system was. Now, had anyone actually read this book in the 1920s, we may have prevented a war. But it was a gibberish, nonsensical mess of a book. I've read it. But he realizes something very important at the outside of this time in jail. If he wants to take over Germany, you can't do it by revolution. You have to do it through illegal means. And so he begins to outline in this book his ideologies, one of which is known as Lebensraum, this idea of living space. Germans need to expand to the east in order to, grow as a nation, to make Germany great again. Of course, who lives in the east? Well, Jews and Slavs. And so Jews, get rid of them, remove them, kill them if possible, and Slavs, enslave them. He also outlines anti-Semitism. He drinks the Kool-Aid and believes that Jews are the reason that Germany lost the war. Jews are the reason that they're in this current political predicament. Jews are the reason for the financial problems of Germany. Again, in any catastrophe, in any major situation, you always want a scapegoat. And Jews made an easy target to be a scapegoat for Adolf Hitler and Germany's problems. He also said that in order to create this Lebensraum and expand and subject the Jews and Slavs, you needed a very powerful ruler that he called a leader-dictator, or Führer, that would have unlimited arbitrary power. Now, of course, what really benefits Adolf Hitler was nothing of his own doing. He just took advantage of situations very well. And what ultimately leads him to the ability to climb to the top and take over Germany is actually the Great Depression. Because during the Great Depression, unemployment is at 43% in 1932. People are desperate. Now, of course, in the United States, we elect a new president, and FDR ignores the idea of being a dictator and instead uses the New Deal, which does help. Hitler, however, in Germany was far worse. While African Americans in the United States had a 50% unemployment rate, the average American was 25%. They're at 43%. Life is rough. Life is really bad. And so Hitler begins to use the situation to start attracting more and more people to the Nazi Party. This is economic chaos. This is political impotence. And it plays right into Adolf Hitler's hands. Hitler was a master at using a situation and creating propaganda to serve his benefits. Now, I've attached a separate document in Schoology that was one of my research papers I wrote as an undergrad. I want you all to read it. It's only about 23 pages long. It's double-spaced. But it outlines how genius Adolf Hitler was when it came to using propaganda. Either that a situation would happen, like the Great Depression, he used it to his advantage, or a situation he created, but still used propaganda to his advantage. Now, again, let me preface this. He's an evil, vile, despicable person who deserves to rot in hell for everything he did. But let's put that aside and read my first paragraph. You'll understand. I cite that right away. Look at it, though, and read through it. It'll provide some tremendous insight into how he's able to achieve power. But for now, though, he promises German voters economic, political, and military salvation. He promises big business leaders he'll restore the economy and make Germany great again by breaking Germany's strong labor movement, reducing workers' wages if necessary, because he will make Germany great again. He assured the top army leaders that Nazis would reject the Versailles Treaty and rearm Germany, which is, of course, a violation of the Versailles Treaty. And, of course, one of his main demographics to support him are younger Germans. 40% of the party are age 30 and younger. By 1931, 67%, 2/3 of the Nazi Party are under the age of 40 because they want the glory days to restore Germany to greatness. The older generations seem to be, well, we saw what life was like under the Tsar system. But this new generation, this under 40 generation, don't really remember life under the Tsar system. All they know is how life is sucky after World War I, and they want to make Germany great again. And so the Nazis began through every election winning more and more seats in the governments, whether local or national. And in the Reichstag, by 1933, they now hold a largest number of votes in the Reichstag. And as a result of that, Hitler demands to have a leadership role in government. Now, did the President von Hindenburg really trust Hitler? No, he knows he's a terrible person. But he needed to pacify the people to maintain hold in the government. And so in 1933, January 30th, just a few days after Franklin Delano Roosevelt is inaugurated, or just before he's inaugurated in Washington, D.C., just a couple months beforehand, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, second in command, appointed by President Paul von Hindenburg, who was a World War I general and hero. Over the next year, he quickly consolidates his power. In 1933, there would be a fire at the Reichstag. You see a picture there on the left. Now, the Reichstag, of course, is the German Capitol building where the Reichstag Congress meets. And It occurred during a violent electoral campaign, so during election season. And of course, this incident was propagandized by the Nazis to crack down on communists. Now, the situation was very literally like this. Hey, guys, see? The building's on fire. There's a guy right there. He's holding a gas can and a lighter, and he's a communist. He did it. Now, we know from history that most likely, 99% sure, that Nazis probably arsoned their building themselves. But the situation puts Germany in a state of emergency. And Hitler, as Chancellor now, was able to enact a part of the Constitution known as the Enabling Act. It was passed by the Reichstag in this great state of fear, and it granted Hitler absolute dictator powers for a period of 4 years. And of course, you gave an egomaniacal, God-complex person temporary dictator powers. Do you really think he's ever going to give it up? And of course, after he becomes dictator, he outlaws all other political parties, and the only legitimate political party now is Nazi Party. He outlaws strikes, he abolishes independent labor unions, and suppresses the free press. That includes, by the way, modern art. Modern art and architecture were prohibited. Now, I'm not a big fan either, but I would never prohibit them. He also begins to ramp up the propaganda movement. And the person, his minister of propaganda, his director of propaganda, is the man pictured on the right of your screen right now, Joseph Goebbels. Now, of course, his job was to glorify Adolf Hitler and the Nazi state and everything that he did. His job was to make Hitler look like a god. And of course, he very famously is quoted by saying, if you repeat a lie often enough, people will begin to accept it as true. This is why we always need a free press to check on the validity of politicians. You don't want someone lying to you constantly. It puts you in a state of flux. And you begin to accept, either you begin to question everything if someone lies constantly, or you begin to, well, accept things as true. Now, he's one aspect of it. The other arm of propaganda, big shot, was Leni Riefenstahl. Leni Riefenstahl created a documentary that became known as Triumph of the Will. And I expect you all to watch this. I'll be posting the link to Schoology so you all can watch this video. It's about 40 minutes long, but it's incredibly powerful to see what she's able to do through media. Again, Hitler was a master at using new technology, using television, in this case movie, to visually show Germany how great he was. The opening scene is him just flying in an airplane as if he's coming down from the heavens to the German people to shake hands with them. Incredibly powerful. Now, he does run into some problems, though, because in 1934, in June, so he's been dictator about a year, he begins to be warned that the army and big businesses were very suspicious of his brown shirts. Now, Hitler wants to maintain control. He knows he needs the military, he needs the conservatives, and so he issues, to pacify these conservatives, the Hitler's personal guard, his elite personal guard known as the SS. They begin to arrest and shoot members of the brown shirts, the SA, without even trials. And the time is known as the Night of Long Knives in June 1934. More than 1,000 brown shirt SA leaders and other political enemies were murdered, executed. What did this do? Well, it took all suspicion away from Hitler as not supporting the conservatives in government and the military, but it also greatly heightened the power of this personal elite guard, the SS Gestapo. Because the SS is going to join with the political police, and they will form what's known as the Gestapo. That will greatly expand the network of spy network, special secret courts, and of course later the concentration camps. They were the ones to round up these political prisoners and of course Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, Slavs. Now, unlike in Italy, Hitler was able to mobilize the entire country via leisure time, especially the youth, and what became known as the Hitler Youth. He indoctrinated, or Nazis did, indoctrinated German youth with views of German racial superiority. And of course, Jews were the source of Germany's social ills. And basically, membership in the Hitler Youth was essentially mandatory. Because if you weren't, you were seen immediately as suspect. Again, this is an example of how totalitarian regimes demand participation of the masses. Again, this is in direct contrast to 17th century absolutism, where pretty much regimes only sought obedience, not participation. They didn't want peasants or lower classes involved. Hitler does. He wants the entire nation. You see them on the right, the Hitler Youth, who are actively involved in trying to make Germany great. Now, after the purge, Night of Long Knives, Hitler then can turn his attention to his real source of animosity, the Jews. And by the end of 1934, most Jewish lawyers, doctors, professors, civil servants, musicians had all lost their job and lost the right to practice their professions. By 1935, they began the Nuremberg Laws that began to deprive Jews of rights of citizenship. Now, please note, the Nuremberg Laws are one term, but they do evolve over a number of years. Now, we cite 1935, but there are a number of laws passed that year that all kind of coalesce as what we call the Nuremberg Laws. A few of them include things like Jews are forbidden from displaying the Reich or national flag. So you would think that Hitler would want them to be proud Germans and proud members of the Third Reich, the Nazi Party. But he wants to make them as outcasts, scapegoats, that they are not even allowed to be patriotic Germans. They're not allowed to be part of that vision of nationalism. Second, marriage or sex between Jews and other Germans is prohibited. Again, you're distancing, you're otherizing them. You're creating Jews and setting them up to be other, outsiders, who are, well, easily disposable. Other laws include Jews cannot use hospitals. They cannot be educated past age 14. They were prohibited from using parks, libraries, beaches. Now, by 1939, half of all Germany's 500,000 Jews had left the country. Most of them, though, were what was called the cream of the crop. People like Albert Einstein. They all left to other European or other Western nations, and of course they would do well because these were the educated elites of society. However, in 1938, you have what's called the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht. 1938, Hitler orders an attack on Jewish communities. Now, why does he do this? Well, supposedly there was an assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a young Jewish boy. So, in Paris, a German diplomat was assassinated supposedly by a young Jewish boy. This became the pretense to order this attack on Jewish communities. See, Jews are evil, therefore attack them. And so the thing was, this was not a wave of mob violence, but rather it was a well-organized, calculated wave of violence that destroyed Jewish homes, synagogues, and businesses. Thousands of Jews were arrested and made to pay for the damage that they didn't cause. They were made to pay for the damage that was done by essentially the Gestapo or the average German. And of course, ultimately with Jews, we can't not talk about the final solution of Adolf Hitler, which of course was somewhere between 6 and 7 million Jews who were murdered, executed, and killed during World War II. But don't forget, they're not the only victims here. Total deaths as part of the concentration camps of Adolf Hitler were somewhere closer to 11 or 12 million. Because that also include other groups like Slavs, Gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, homosexuals, mentally handicapped, and of course, political opponents. Now, all that aside though, what good did Hitler do? Well, Hitler was incredibly popular in Germany for one very good reason. Hitler delivered on his economic promise of work and bread. He promised, much like any politician would do, he had his campaign promise. It was, quote, work and bread, unquote. He would put you to work, therefore you would have bread on your table. Remember, when inflation was rampant of the German mark in the 1920s, they were burning the mark. People were out of work, 43% unemployment during the Depression. And Hitler changed all of that economically. Thanks to large public works projects, thanks to remilitarizing their country. Between public works and remilitarization, he's able to get Germany out of the Depression in just a few years. So large public works projects include like the superhighways like the Autobahn, offices, buildings, skyscrapers, gigantic sports stadiums, and of course, public housing. And you see one of the stadiums right there pictured. On the right, of course, will be the host of the 1936 Olympic Games held in Berlin, signaling to the world of Germany's legitimacy in the international community. Think about this for a minute. He pulled out of the League of Nations. He violated the Treaty of Versailles, refused reparation payments. And yet Germany became accepted as an international community member because of what Hitler was able to do economically under Nazism. And of course, 1936, they begin to rearm. They begin government spending to focus on the military. And unemployment drops from about 6 million in 1933 to only 1 million in just 3 years. By 1938, there was a shortage of workers existing. In fact, women would actually enter the workforce where they had previously been denied by anti-feminist Nazis. But women were forced to go to work. They needed them to because there was a labor shortage in Germany due to all the work being done by building infrastructure buildings, infrastructure projects, buildings, and of course, militarization. The standard of living did raise for the average worker, and profits of businesses did rise sharply. Now, was there really a social revolution in Germany? Well, the reality is the well-educated classes held on to most of the advantage they had prior to Hitler. And really only modest social leavening actually occurred. And like in Italy, women were largely viewed as housewives and mothers whose main job, as Hitler said, quote, German women were to, quote, make babies for the Reich, unquote. In fact, birth control, information, and abortions were forbidden for German women. But they were allowed, both of them were allowed, for unwanted groups such as Jews, Gypsies, and Slavs. Think about this eugenics movement that Hitler admired from the United States, and especially California. You only let certain people procreate, all others either allow them to have abortions or, if you can, sterilize them. And so, again, he's an evil, vile, despicable human being who deserves a rotten hell. But Hitler did, economically, lead Germany out of the Depression. He did make Germany great again. And he did provide some level of modest social leveling, though women were largely left out of it until as we get closer to the labor shortage issues of the late 1930s. Now, that's it for today, but when we come back next time, we will move on and discuss, of course, the beginnings of World War II. Until next time, please like this video, subscribe down below, and bye-bye.